one thing that I've noticed, right, in this space where we're talking about erasing the categories of race, and not only the categories, but the language, the way we communicate about it, just to completely annihilate this concepts on an individual basis to then catalyze a societal change. Is that kind of an accurate way of describing the methodology here?
I think it's part of it. I think what people miss too often when they talk about the systemic nature of racism is the fact that belief systems, knowledge systems, is also what allows something like racism to be systemic, and it is a system. So we cannot take the individual out of the system that we're analyzing or talking about and trying to improve. Thereby, if we recognize that the continued belief and upholding of race ideology is the cause for and helping to maintain racism in a systemic manner, then it makes sense to me to drill down into that part of society where we continue to teach generation after generation that this is what the society is, this is what it will always be, that this makes sense, that this is a productive way to think of ourselves and to divide ourselves amongst ourselves, and so on and so forth. And if we could get to that place, and if we could stop teaching our children to do the same things that we've been taught ourselves, and that we've probably been taught by our parents and our grandparents and so on, then we can start to change truly the fabric of the system that many of us say that we want to have some sort of meaningful impact on. And I'll say part of that work too necessitates the fact that in order to change the system outside of knowledge, outside of belief systems, outside of the individual, indeed, we have to be very clear-eyed about what racism is, what it isn't, how it has material impacts on people. And we shouldn't overlook the fact that racism impacts people on an individual level as well as on a systemic level. It impacts people's psychological well-being and wellness. It impacts people's psyches. And to the extent that we continue to do anti-racism in the ways that we have, then people will still continue to adopt and inherit those kinds of traumas that we could just as easily begin to address now, as we also address the more systemic whole society impacts of racism.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with all that. I totally agree that we need to attack the problem from multiple angles because it's a multidimensional problem. And,
Absolutely.
it's something that really resonated with a lot of people on Twitter when I first started getting on and talking to random people about race. The idea that it was a multidimensional problem that required solutions that approach different aspects of the problem. You're talking about attacking the problem from a kind of grassroots level, from an individual kind of person level, to kind of expand people's minds about what's possible, about the world that's possible in the future, about what they can do individually to kind of create that world and to catalyze that world. And I think that's great. It's the kind of work that I also want to do. But I would say that my work, and we kind of talked about this a little bit in our pre-interview conference, is more focused on, I would say, the heart. The heart. I find in my conversations of decades of these conversations about race that specifically in the racialized white community, that there is some kind of barrier that exists to communicating about race, to even thinking about it. There is a lot of shame associated with thinking about it and communicating about it. And this barrier, I believe, to be extremely significant, and a huge impediment to the kind of world that you're talking about trying to create through your theory. So, how does your theory address such an impediment? And have you encountered it yourself?
Well, part of my argument is that one of the reasons why there are many types of barriers from people who are racialized in many different ways is because we continue to talk about race and thereby racism using the same language and the same sort of methodology. And even though we seldom seem to acknowledge or recognize the fact that something that seems super progressive and radical now, if you know the history of race and if you know the genealogy of philosophies of race, you recognize it to be the same old when it comes to the landscape of how we're trying to solve and indeed resolve racism. And so the barriers remain, and they've been consistent for well over a century, largely because of that reason. So one way that my theory offers a solution, a sort of intervention into that space, thereby opening the door to more people to participate meaningfully and more generatively, is the fact that I'm approaching it from a place of racelessness or deracialization. So I encourage people and invite people to step into and embrace what I recognize as their current racelessness. And from a place of racelessness, now let's look at what race is doing in any context to identify, is it something cultural that's being communicated? Is it something ethnic? Is it social class or economic class? Or is it racism itself? And a lot of the times, when you're able to help people translate the thing that they initially identify as race or racial into more apt language and into more precise language from this place of deracialization, it does open the landscape a bit, because the feelings that would otherwise be associated with being a racialized white person, or being racialized in any other way, that barrier is dramatically increased. It might still be there for some folks because, I mean, it's new information. If Sheena Mason comes into the room, it's going to be new information. And so it might take people a minute to warm up, right? To really engage with what it is I'm actually saying and what it is I'm encouraging them to do. But I find people respond very generatively and positively to my work. And some of the reasons for that they've articulated to me, but also just being an astute observer that I've recognized, is because they don't feel like they're being painted into the corner. And as much as we might view feelings of guilt and shame as being part of human life in some ways, part of healing and reconciliation, maybe part of facing something head on, I find that it's actually more of a barrier, as you said. And ironically, it's more of a barrier, as you said. So if we really want to open that up, right? If we really want to open the door up to more people, then we have to consider a different methodology in order to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't think doing the same old that hasn't worked is a good idea. Talk a little bit about your analysis of literature, of African American literature, in talking about how we should be using language to kind of not reify, as you would say, right? Race. Okay, so can you talk about how you instruct people to use language so that they're not reifying race in their everyday life?
Well, part of my consistent journey has been around the question of language. And some people might hear that and say, oh, just this is semantics. It would be semantics if we weren't talking about racism, a very high stakes reality. And it would be semantics if we weren't talking about addressing and solving racism and stopping it in its tracks. So the ways in which language can either help or hurt us in that endeavor has been something that I've been admittedly obsessing over. And one of the temporary solutions that I found in terms of how I personally work to avoid reifying the same category that I'm criticizing and working to destroy, is by inserting the word racialized before Black or racialized before white or Asian or any race, just to flag the fact that race is not of nature, it's not biological, not in any meaningful sense, and definitely not in the ways that many Americans tend to think of it. And so some sort of outside external force is happening that racializes people into the categories that we often see ourselves and see each other in American society. So I'll use the word racialized if I have to talk about race language, which really comes primarily when I'm talking about racism, because as much as I would like to skip to the good part, what I don't want people to miss is I'm not advocating for we just magically, pull the carpet out from under ourselves and just leave race out of it and just pretend like racism still isn't a thing. That's not it. But if we're going to talk about race, we can talk about it without naturalizing it. So I use the word racialized, or I'll use the word so-called. That was Albert Murray's and Ralph Ellison's go-to so-called white person, so-called Black person. And then if it's on paper, if it's in text, then I might put quotation marks around the racial category to indicate again the sort of fallacy of it. And I've even come to put that around the word race itself, because as you know, I am a racial skeptic. So those are just a couple of the strategies that I've been adopting and hoping to improve. The more I learn and the more I grow, and then the more I develop my theory, because I do think there's probably a more efficient and effective way to do that, but I just don't yet know in this early stage of my journey what that is.
Well, you've got me saying racialized.
I heard that before we came on. I was like, oh, he's saying racialized. I love it.
Yeah, I learned it from you and from Angel, and I took it to heart because, to be honest, Sheena, I haven't really run into a lot of people who I think that believe race is a natural thing. I have been, at least that I've been able to discern, and I get pretty deep. I've been around the country, talked to a lot of people. I really don't encounter many people. I did when I was a child, when people were just learning about the concept of race. I met a lot of people who believed all kinds of things about being Black, about you know about all kinds of things. Like I actually have a poem. If you go on my YouTube channel called "Contraband of Race War," and in it I tell the story of a six-year-old who stopped me in elementary school in the hallway, and he was like, "Why don't you act Black?" And I'm like, what do you mean by that? And he's like, well, you don't curse. Well, you get good grades. Well, you're not in a gang. And he just starts rattling off all these. And I was just like, I was like, what? And I guess I was lucky in the fact that I was educated pretty early on by my father, mostly, about the civil rights movement, about Dr. King, about a lot of the history before I even entered school. So I knew, I feel like I had some information that student didn't have, and that I wasn't as susceptible to believing that as he was, which is, to me, just an exemplar of how important education is, especially the kind of education that you want to do. My sticking point.
Let's get into it.
Okay, you said largely because of that reason, and that reason was the language that we use. That is largely because of that reason we are still dealing with race. That's what you said.
I would expand that to, or I guess clarify that what I think really is at the core of why racism persists in the ways that it does is because alternative philosophies of race continue to be marginalized and excluded from the public domain and public conversations, which means that we get put into the default categories of how to think about race and what we think should be done with race. And those default categories have taken us as far as we can. I think ultimately, if there was a way in which what got canonized, the sort of ideas, the voices that were privileged, the philosophies of race that were privileged, and taught across really all spheres of American education. At the core of that canonization and who chooses what gets taught and all of that has been and has necessitated the upholding of race ideology. And
Can you?
even when
Sorry,
we're
hang
at
on,
our
hang on.
best.
I don't mean to interrupt you there, but can you expand on that one point there? How?
Mm-hmm.
I have to understand more about that, because for me, that needs some explanation. Like how?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. So in science class, you're still taught that there are a certain number of races of human beings. In history class, you're taught race through how you talk about racism. Everyone is racialized through these conscious and even unconscious ways, so that even by the time you're 10, if you are a racialized Black kid in America, and if you've experienced racism in any capacity, which is likely that you have, the ways that people talk to you about what that racism is and what the thing is, you are racialized. If you are a racialized white kid, you're racialized within the context of what it is to be a white person in American society or in the world. And so because we use the language without any kind of disclaimer or qualifier, because we still have archaic science programs and the like, where people are still taught to believe in biological race. And I know you mentioned that you haven't really met a lot of people who believe that, but just because you haven't met them doesn't mean that that's not a thing.
Of course
And
not. I don't mean to imply
right,
that.
right. So my friend Tade is a geneticist, and he spends an inordinate amount of time on social media of all places, of course, debating and arguing with people and trying to show them the science that he knows to sort of disprove their belief and insistent that race is biological. So we don't get that from nowhere. We're taught that, whether it's through media, whether it's through our primary and secondary school educations, we get taught that. And I can say in my field, how it manifests is African American literature is my primary field. How it manifests in that field is across the entire landscape of African American literature. The people who have been qualified as being African American or formerly Negro or Black, they were decided as such based on their DNA and ancestry, first and foremost, not even phenotype. One would think it's skin color, because that's how a lot of Americans think race, that's what it is, or largely depended on. But back in the day, the one drop rule was a real thing. People still believe in that. So you have people that are Negro writers in the canon who, for all intents and purposes, they look like racialized white men, but they're Negro. Why? Because they have the one drop of Black blood, the one metaphorical drop of Black blood. And so even in the canon of literature that was largely created in response to and to combat and resist racism, it has come to be defined as always having to do necessarily with race and racism. And when you look at the scholarship of that same literature, both how people get racialized as this is the literature, this is the genre that they're writing in as being African American or otherwise Black, and how it's interpreted, almost inevitably, all of the interpretations are focusing on race, even when the text, and this is what I illustrate in my forthcoming book, even when the text is doing something far more complicated, or is even going against the race ideology that many scholars have continued to uphold as it pertains to interpreting and teaching the literature. So then you're getting into the higher education where, for a decent amount of time now, but a short time considering how long the country has been in existence, people have been required to take a multi-ethnic or some kind of multicultural literature or fulfill some sort of gen ed along those lines, right? So they might come into contact with African American literature in that way for that reason, or they might come into contact with Caribbean literature or post-colonial literature more broadly, class that I'm teaching right now in next semester. And yet and still, how professors are going to teach about and talk about that literature is going to be in the language of race. And because that remains a fact, and that has been how people have spoken about, taught about, written about the history and the literature that comes in response to that history when it's playing out, right? That has unintentionally maintained the category and the belief in race ideology to the point where somebody like I come in the room and I'm talking about the theory of racelessness, and right away some people might be on guard and wondering if I'm crazy because they're going to misconstrue what it is that's being said just by hearing the word racelessness, right? It's not what I'm supposed to think. It's not what I'm supposed to teach. And I would know because I'm living my own life, right? I, when I was at Howard, you better believe I was the extreme statistical minority of people talking anything outside of race ideology. And all of my classmates, all of them, defined the literature as in the authorship as being based by skin color or DNA. And they said and basically demanded of those writers that they have to be talking about and protesting about racism and showing the beauty of race, right? So you cannot, for some reason it's too easy to overlook or to misinterpret, but I think that the reason why that remains the case is because alternative philosophies of race aren't anywhere on the table. I happened upon it accidentally. I wasn't intending to come down this path. That's just where my intellect took me. And unfortunately, most people aren't going to have the wherewithal to accidentally find themselves in this other way of looking at things. And because I found myself on the other way of looking at things, it opened up a whole new world to me regarding the literature, regarding the history, and regarding social science here and now, and how people talk about and teach about and continue to maintain the problem. And again, I do think it's largely unintentional. None of my issues were with the students. Right? I see some teachers on social media, we'll call it venting about their students in certain contexts, right? But in my experience with Freedom Summer, and I did Teach for America, so I taught in Houston for 2 years, 9th through 12th grade. I never had a single complaint with any of my students, not a single one. It was always the administration. It was always these external factors that were impeding my ability to do what I wanted to do for my students. So
yeah, and if you ask any teacher about it, they'll tell you the exact same thing. Unfortunately, a lot of people outside of education are a little bit clueless about what teachers are facing in this country. But you're going to learn. There are a lot of people working on changing what's happening in education and in the teaching profession specifically, myself included. I'm the president of the Wake Tech chapter of the American Association of University Professors. And we've aligned ourselves to advocate for ourselves because our leadership is not doing such a great job at that. And so you're going to hear more and more about educators, fighting for their own dignity and the dignity of their students because they go hand in hand, as you were kind of alluding to earlier. Kind of a mainstream belief that the kind of work that you're doing is, number one, unnecessary, and number two, ineffective. And that's something I see on social media all the time is people touting that, putting up graphs, all this stuff. So what would you say to those opponents of what you've devoted yourself to, right?
Well, firstly, you can't, I won't say what people can't do in this instance. I will say that I do find it interesting when people have a conclusion about something they know nothing about. Because, and again, part of that is paradoxically, part of that is a language problem because it's the theory of racelessness. So people have ideas about what racelessness is, for better, for worse. And then if you're outside of academia, I feel like you probably fall into this trap as well of not really recognizing what it means for it to be a theory. And then some people, you know, they think that's a euphemism for this is an opinion or it's just my perspective. And that's fine and dandy, but once you know what a theory is outside of the sort of commonplace opinion or idea, then you kind of recognize the meat, that there's substance to what I'm saying and there's depth to what I'm saying. And I didn't just wake up yesterday. And like you, my journey has been a long one. Like when I was an undergraduate, I did an advanced honors thesis, you know, no big deal. It was 100-page paper, which for an undergraduate, you can recognize that
Yeah, that's
was
extensive.
pretty substantial. And I studied on African American literature, and it's specifically looking at the idea of authenticity and representation as it pertained to people racialized as Black. And I was interested in Percival Everett's novel Erasure, which started me down the path of studying all of the ins and outs of authenticity and representation and the history of African American literary studies as well. And then it kind of makes perfect sense how I came down this path when you know that that's where I started deep diving into my research. But even as a PhD student, which mind you, I took a lot of gap years between all of my degrees. So I didn't have the privilege of just going degree. So I lived a lot between times, right? And then I find myself a PhD student. I'm still deeply interested in continuing my research in virtually the same areas. And when I started to recognize something in the literature and the history and how society operates as it pertains to racism, I wanted to resist it. I was like Smeagol talking to myself, you know, in the pond, but in his instance, but in the mirror in mine. I didn't want to be I didn't want to be that Black person. That's what I was thinking at the time. I didn't want to be the voice or the perspective that was misconstrued and lambasted and thrown into the dustbins of forgotten history. I wanted to do more substantial work. And it's not that I wanted to, quote unquote, fit in, right? Because that was never going to happen because I've never fit in anywhere in my life, it seems. But I just didn't want to be that person. I was scared. I didn't fully understand at that early stage. So I remember I cried to my advisor a few times, and she said, Sheena, you don't have to be the martyr. You don't have to now all of a sudden, because this is where your mind has taken you, you stop calling yourself a Black woman. You don't have to do that. You write about it, you publish about it, you talk about it, you teach about it, you do all of that. It's the next generation that will pick up the torch and pick up your work and work toward this, you know, future that you're imagining or whatever. So I was satisfied, but I was dissatisfied because I recognized that I couldn't be a hypocrite. I knew what I knew, and I couldn't unknow what I knew. So I couldn't be a hypocrite. And it wasn't until about 2 or so years after those sessions with my mentor, seemingly therapy sessions, by the way, that I was able to unlock something in my brain and recognize that the reason why it was painful for me, this idea of letting go of my quote unquote Blackness or my Black identity, was because I was in the trap that I was identifying other people as being in as well, which is that race, I was conflating race with everything under the sun, including everything positive and everything I loved about myself. And that ultimately, if I peeled back the layers, I came to recognize that none of what I loved about myself was racial. None of it had anything to do with this so-called category of race. And once I recognize that, I recognize that the only thing I'm advocating for in undoing the belief in race is the undoing of racism. That's it, which is arguably all negative. Like it's not beneficial to human society. So once I recognized that, I was full speed ahead, and nobody has been able to stop me yet.
Kind of a mainstream belief that the kind of work that you're doing is, number one, unnecessary, and number two, ineffective. And that's something I see on social media all the time, is people touting that, putting up graphs, all this stuff. So what would you say to those opponents of what you've devoted yourself to, right?
Well, firstly, you can't. I won't say what people can't do in this instance. I will say that I do find it interesting when people have a conclusion about something they know nothing about, because, and again, part of that is, paradoxically, part of that is a language problem, because it's the theory of racelessness. So people have ideas about what racelessness is, for better, for worse, and then if you're outside of academia, I feel like you probably fall into this trap as well, of not really recognizing what it means for it to be a theory. And then some people, they think that's a euphemism for this is an opinion, or it's just my perspective. And that's fine and dandy, but once you know what a theory is outside of the sort of commonplace opinion or idea, then you kind of recognize the meat, that there's substance to what I'm saying, and there's depth to what I'm saying. And I didn't just wake up yesterday. And like you, my journey has been a long one. Like when I was an undergraduate, I did an advanced honors thesis, no big deal. It was 100-page paper, which for an undergraduate, you can recognize that
that's extensive.
was pretty substantial. And I studied on African-American literature, and it's specifically looking at the idea of authenticity and representation as it pertained to people racialized as Black. And I was interested in Percival Everett's novel Erasure, which started me down the path of studying all of the ins and outs of authenticity and representation, and the history of African-American literary studies as well. And then it kind of makes perfect sense how I came down this path, when you know that that's where I started deep diving into my research. But even as a PhD student, which, mind you, I took a lot of gap years between all of my degrees, so I didn't have the privilege of just going degree. So I lived a lot between times, right? And then I find myself a PhD student. I'm still deeply interested in continuing my research in virtually the same areas. And when I started to recognize something in the literature and the history and how society operates as it pertains to racism, I wanted to resist it. I was like Smeagol talking to myself, in the pond, but in his instance, but in the mirror in mine. I didn't want to be, I didn't want to be that Black person. That's what I was thinking at the time. I didn't want to be the voice or the perspective that was misconstrued and lambasted and thrown into the dustbins of forgotten history. I wanted to do more substantial work. And it's not that I wanted to, quote unquote, fit in, right? Because that was never going to happen, because I've never fit in anywhere in my life, it seems. But I just didn't want to be that person. I was scared. I didn't fully understand at that early stage. So I remember I cried to my advisor a few times, and she said, Sheena, you don't have to be the martyr. You don't have to now all of a sudden, because this is where your mind has taken you, you stop calling yourself a Black woman. You don't have to do that. You write about it, you publish about it, you talk about it, you teach about it, you do all of that. It's the next generation that will pick up the torch and pick up your work and work toward this, future that you're imagining or whatever. So I was satisfied, but I was dissatisfied because I recognized that I couldn't be a hypocrite. I knew what I knew, and I couldn't unknow what I knew. So I couldn't be a hypocrite. And it wasn't until about 2 or so years after those sessions with my mentor, seemingly therapy sessions, by the way, that I was able to unlock something in my brain and recognize that the reason why it was painful for me, this idea of letting go of my quote unquote blackness or my black identity, was because I was in the trap that I was identifying other people as being in as well, which is that race, I was conflating race with everything under the sun, including everything positive and everything I loved about myself. And that ultimately, if I peeled back the layers, I came to recognize that none of what I loved about myself was racial. None of it had anything to do with this so-called category of race. And once I recognized that, I recognized that the only thing I'm advocating for in undoing the belief in race is the undoing of racism. That's it, which is arguably all negative. Like it's not beneficial to human society. So once I recognized that, I was full speed ahead, and nobody has been able to stop me yet. And the last thing I'll say is I feel it's all of our responsibilities to work together to overcome this thing and do something different for our future generations. But what I find a lot of people do when they talk to me about my theory is they center this thing called whiteness, or they center racialized white people and that their role in racism and the history of it, etc. And what people too often miss, that I want to invite viewers to consider, is the ways in which racism and liberating oneself from racism on an individual level is cannot be diminished or devalued. The benefits of that. My students call it intellectual, spiritual, and emotional work. And they say that although it's hard and although it is a choice, they have to choose, okay, am I going to open my mind to what Dr. Mason is saying? Or am I just going to hold on to the ideology I came into the class with? For those that make the decision to have an open mind, they say they can never go back to thinking how they did. So it would actually take them more effort to go backward and sort of regress back into the comfiness and coziness of upholding race ideology. And that shows you the sort of individual power that this gives people. And it gives people the sort of clarity and in some instances, peace of mind as it pertains to the future making potential of this type of endeavor. Because as you said, it is easy to sort of devolve into sort of doom and gloom, a pessimistic standpoint. But I think what's more beneficial for everyone is to have really the exact opposite, right? To have endless and fierceless, is that a word? Fierce hope. I think that's how we do the work for ourselves, which is what we really should be doing it for. Who we should be doing it for is ourselves. And then once we've achieved that, then we can open the door and extend that sort of insight and path to other people. And if we're doing it for ourselves first, then arguably it's going to be out of a place of love, a place of love for oneself. And then you can love other people by extension. I'm going to get off my soapbox. Thanks for listening to me.
No. This is your chance.
I was like, I have to share this with Will. I have to share.
Listen, this was your chance to speak, and I'm glad you took it. I appreciate your stories.
When you were talking about the different barriers that exist, I was thinking about my students in the Mississippi Delta or the students that I worked with in Houston. And I was thinking about, all I know about the achievement gap. And I feel like one of the underestimated causes of the achievement gap remains the sort of racist belief about students who are racialized as Black, especially, and that internalized racism manifests itself in how racialized young people are treated and how they're taught in the methodologies through which they're taught and the sort of standards that are there or not there. And I think this is more of a problem in impoverished communities and schools with little resources. But I've just happened to have worked in schools where most of my students were racialized Black students, because the people who lived in that community, desegregation didn't change much to change how the communities look. And so segregation still exists in different pockets and aspects of American life. And separate has never meant equal. So it's still separate and unequal. And as a result of that, the teachers of those same students, sometimes I think it's really subconscious. I don't think this is on purpose. They don't believe that racialized Black kids can learn. And so they basically treat them accordingly. And so that's why you see such a gap, a learning gap between, first graders in a less affluent community and first graders in an affluent community. And then that gap just increases. And then when you have added to that the sort of environmental factors that might push or pull students from participating more fully in their education or not, and all of that, more often than not, you see that worsening across time. So that by the time I'm meeting the student, they're in ninth grade, and not only have they internalized the messages that their teachers have unintentionally communicated to them, and the administrators have unintentionally communicated to them, which is that they come to believe that they cannot learn, right? They come to believe that their futures are limited for X, Y, and Z reasons, all out of their control. I think that that's a pernicious cycle that I hope to have a meaningful impact on, because I see the power have lived the power of recognizing the humanity of my students and treating them accordingly. And then all of a sudden, because I've created a winning culture, if you will, all of my students are winning, to the point of then when it comes time to take the ACT or the SAT, they have huge measurable increases in successes as it pertains to those exams, which we know are then influential in college prospects and all of that, which I extend to economic prospects. And so that's one aspect of our society that I'm really passionate about having an impact on. And it's one of my motivating factors for the theory of racelessness too, because I think for a lot of reasons, including the fact that I think that it's ultimately racist beliefs about the types of young people that I've described that encourage and maintain cycles of poverty in certain communities and areas. And it's something that is more solvable than we would think, that costs no money virtually, right? And how we help those students is by getting to those teachers and helping those teachers, as you said, have more, not just more honest conversations about racism, but become more clear-eyed about what that is and how it manifests itself, and give them the toolkit and the knowledge needed to stop passing that way of thinking onto the children, which does have an impact on hindering the mindsets that already are encouraged. And then the last thing I'll say is some people fall into the trap or the sort of pitfall of, well, they're talking about racism, so they're just talking about black versus white. But I view it as so much more complicated than that, because at the outset of our conversation, you did ask me what was the sort of impetus for my theory. And I don't know if I actually said this out loud, but it was my deep desire to address and better identify intra-group problems and fractures. And at the time when I first started my doctoral program, the intra group I'm talking about, I was thinking of Black people. I was in love with other racialized Black people. And I was about the life of figuring out what causes this, what causes that, what causes this, what causes that on an intergroup level. Had nothing to do with racialized white people at all. Nothing to do with racialized white people. And it was through my hyper focus on the intergroup stuff that I became aware of all of the things we've been talking about, because, you know, the fact that many Americans think there's a way to talk Black or a way to talk white, those are beliefs that a lot of people adopt regardless of their racialization. That's not a white versus Black thing. That's often a Black versus Black thing. And part of the reason why that those kinds of ideas continue to persist, I think, to the detriment of some racialized Black people, is because we keep talking about racism and the language of race ideology, which naturalizes one's belief in race, which then unfortunately naturalizes the racist ideas that are attached to it. And if we can't control what other people are going to do, but the one thing we can have control over is ourselves. And in reasserting our own self-agency and our own power, and in reasserting the fact that racism has an impact on every individual as well as on the entire community, then we can truly uproot the thing in ways that have material impacts and effects on every individual for their betterment, not to their detriment, as we're currently doing things. So that's, I mean, you kind of almost poetically hit on some aspects that I want to emphasize and highlight regarding our society and this talk about racism, because I think how we're doing anti-racism now actually precludes us from solving some of those solvable issues. And I'm passionate about advocating for young people because, you know, been there, done that. And I work with these young people now, and they deserve so much more, and I want more for them. But I do believe that we can't give more of them what they deserve and what they need without getting our hands around this race language and race ideology.
I totally agree. You know, you don't go into teaching for 16 years because you don't love it and don't care about helping kids and students, you know. And I've taught people from age 3 to 73 math, writing, swimming, poker, music. And I absolutely love sharing knowledge.